Welcome to John Wick Cram. Let's go. Crashed, banged, and walloped from one hell of a night, John Wick thinks of his love before passing out. And we jump right back to much earlier in the tale, where a slick and quiet John Wick lives in a slick and quiet house that no longer feels like a home, because he's a man who's just experienced the loss of his wife and finds himself suddenly having to exist without her. All the trappings of luxury are hollow and empty for a man alone. In the rain, an old associate tells John he's just checking up on an old friend, but this is the only person to speak to him directly, a man removed from our world even at the wake. Evening delivery, and John receives a puppy with a note from his dead wife Helen, encouraging him to still love something and find his peace, giving him an opportunity not to grieve alone. So with something in his life that requires him to continue on, man and dog face the day. But an unfortunate quirk of fate has him cross paths with some Russian gangsters headed by Theon Greyjoy, who takes a shine to his sweet ride. And it turns out Wick knows Russian and isn't intimidated by the crowd. Smells like upcoming trouble, but John has to go and get some time in ragging his car about the place, both as a way of keeping his driving skills sharp and as a method of working through his emotions. Woken by the puppy in the middle of the night, our Russian friends trash John's house, steal his car, and kill the dog, breaking the golden rule of cinema and setting the scene for payment in blood. The Russian brat tries to get the car chopped, but Luigi recognizes it and sends them on their way, as it seems that John is a noted figure in some crime circles and given respect, though we've yet to learn why. Turns out this young punk is Vigo's son called Josef, and he's a real prick because his father is an actual man of power. So John gets a replacement ride, and Luigi gets a phone call from Vigo about striking his son. But upon realizing who his kid had just mugged off, this big underworld boss is suddenly deeply concerned.
Have you seen my son?
The older generation all seem to know what the name of John Wick means.
So I stole the fucking car!
And Dad takes a moment to tell his son the error of his ways, because John Wick wasn't just the bogeyman, but the one you sent to kill the fucking bogeyman. Described as a man of focus, commitment, and sheer will. A man who once killed 3 guys in a bar with a pencil, and who'd piled bodies sky high for the criminal underworld before leaving for his wife. Meanwhile, John is digging up his own weapon-filled past before Vigo gives him a call to see if the two of them are still friends.
Let us not resort to our baser instinct to move on.
No. So he sends a preemptive attack team over to John's home that he's ultimately been waiting for, because the man is dressed to kill and starts ruthlessly culling them with efficient headshot marksmanship and ice-cold focus. Experienced with close quarters gunfighting and group suppression, it's a grim and visceral scene that displays the kind of action moves that had otherwise been missing from a lot of early 2000s shaky cam cinema. An underworld subculture is starting to take form with its own rather laid-back police officers.
You, working again?
No, just sorting some stuff out.
As well as its own unique currency and cleaners. John may have been out of the game, but he still knows who to call to take care of any rubbish. Things are only going to escalate from here. So Vigo visits Willem Dafoe to let him personally know about a $2 million open contract to kill John. And Dafoe seems to accept, despite having history with the guy and there being other killers out in the field. He's got his own stash of gun porn, and after rubbing out a rifle or two, watches John as he checks in to the Continental Hotel. This place is a unique demilitarized safe zone for those in the murder trade, owned by Lovejoy, and everyone's curious at seeing his face back on the scene. And after briefly remembering the one moment of happiness in his life, it's a killer that steps out of a room to join the nightlife of the Continental, where the owner Winston reminds him that after having been a man who got out of the trade, getting back in is only going to lead to trouble. Turns out, for double the bounty, there's an assassin that's willing to break the no murder rules of the Continental, but John has sniffed out where Josef is hiding and suits up to go clubbing. There's plenty of security expecting a visit, as well as a lot of 80s neon and hot babes. But John starts by letting an old acquaintance walk away with his life before going into full murder mode. Everyone inside is serious about the situation, with the exception of course of Josef, who is an endlessly unlikable prick. But out of nowhere we start with this poor guy before John kills Josef's number 2, and we get to see just what kind of a feared legend this man is, as he slowly and systematically executes the security team under some wonderful shots of great cinematography. And after getting rough with some handy groundwork, he lines up a shot on Yosef simply just to let it sink in that the bogeyman is here and that he's going to take his time. All of these pockets of violence have been set to ambient synthwave vocals before Yosef runs up into the main club with his pants down, and John pursues into some hard house violence in all of its glory. But despite sending the majority of the Russians off to heaven, their head of security is also no joke, and manages to go toe-to-toe with John in a tough fight before throwing him over a balcony and convincing him to call it a night. Back at the Continental, he orders up a surgeon and a drink, giving more form to the underground network and its resources with a 24/7 private on-call doctor. It looks like Defoe might be the one to break the Continental rulebook, but he's just there to give John a wake-up call so that he can roughly catch up with an old associate. These guys all know their Brazilian jiu-jitsu, but there's been a noise complaint, so in return for her life, Perkins gives up Vigo's stash location and John gets her a babysitter.
Catch and release. Catch and release.
So it's time to head to church for a confession, which has changed a little bit in how it's done since my day. And after having hurt Vigo financially, he's lured the rest of the Russians out to come and inspect the damage. Meanwhile, Perkins has had enough of her babysitter and breaks out to blow his face in, whilst John is wasting no time by dropping in with an assault rifle in the middle of the street. It's clear as day that John Keanu Wick has undergone a lot of combat training for his role, and it pays off in almost every scene. But despite this, car always beats man, and the tables have suddenly turned. All of Vigo's blackmail assets and leverage across most of the city just went up in that fire, and he tells John that his wife was taken from him as divine punishment for his former deeds, as it seems that everyone in this underworld is paying the price for the actions of their past. Well, instead of fear, John comes out with some real dark bogeyman shit, and not 100% mentally stable, giving off some serious Rorschach vibes instead. So Vigo makes the classic mistake of walking away whilst assuming the main character is being killed without a hitch, as Defoe has continued to guardian angel the situation around John ever since the hit was put out. And despite being tied up, John does what he knows best with some drawn-out floor work before immediately giving chase with a combat shotgun to convince Vigo to both pull the contract and ultimately give up the location of his son. And it doesn't take the killer long to announce his presence with some more headshots, blowing up their escape plan and striding up into focus without a moment of hesitation. The sniveling target of his revenge, ultimately having just been another dead man walking since the start of the film. A real gravitas and punishment comes now, as Vigo considers the unavoidable loss of his son against the bogeyman and turns to some revenge of his own. Defoe is defanged and beaten brutally for not taking his opportunity to kill John and leave his son alive. Looks like he's been sold out by Perkins, but the last of the old guard gives them nothing and goes out on his own terms. This move was a bad one. John Wick was done and on his way back out again after having completed his task. But Vigo's revenge has dragged him right back into the mess. The Perkins problem is finally taken care of after having broken the safe space rules of the Continental, and Lovejoy tips the scales a little further by telling Wick that Vigo is headed for a helicopter pickup over at the port.
Oh, fuck.
So all of that stunt driving training blooms into some car combat sessions with some high flex casual driver side accuracy and a lovely bit of rooftop rollover killing after driving a guy down. And so it all boils down to no more guys, no more guns, and no more bullets. Both men are left in the rain with nothing left to lose, and John and Vigo lean in hard to fight it out. All of the pretense of civility and professionalism is stripped away, and the Russian pulls a classic bad guy move by bringing a knife to a fist fight, only for John to accept the stab in order to retain the blade and tear out the man's elbow instead before finishing the kill.
Good seeing you, Dom. Yeah.
before we find ourselves back where we started at the beginning of the film, with John Wick bleeding out into the night. Oh my god. But still with a will to survive, he breaks into a veterinary clinic to treat his wounds and steals someone's dog? I think we're gonna have to assume that one's a rescue. And together they head back out of the game, where John can live his life once more. John Wick burns around the Neon City streets in his muscle car rental as he hunts after a bike courier in order to snatch up a wedding invite that gets him inside the organization of the Russian crime boss Abram, Vigo's brother, who's not going to make the same mistake of sending people out to kill him, but instead is packing up his operations because John has been homing in on this guy the whole time for unfortunately being in possession of his stolen car. It's been kept in mint condition, which is great because John then spends the next 10 minutes getting it smashed all the way to hell again by using it like a hammer to park bikes, break hips, and smash rides, before ejecting out himself to engage in some ruthless grappling and fatal takedowns, getting a little bit of his own car medicine, whilst basically keeping up the idea that he's not happy to see people by blowing out the legs of anybody that's taller than him. Yet, remembering that he's on his way out of this whole life, John offers peace, which Abram smartly accepts to go and enjoy the rest of his retirement and remember his dead wife alongside a dog that should be much harder to kill than the last one. Luigi's not impressed by the condition of his ride, and Wick reburies all of his murder stuff once more, only he might have been a bit premature, because that night he receives a visit from the Italian crime prince Santino D'Antonio, an old acquaintance from his days as a killer who's come to call in a blood debt on John. But our man declines to fulfill his marker, so instead Santino grabs a grenade launcher and blows up John's house, which where I come from is actually considered very rude. So he just walks all the way back into the city to the Continental to have a word with Lovejoy, who tells John that he pretty much deserved to have his house burnt down for making a promise to a crime lord and failing to honor it. These markers are blood oaths set out from the high table itself, and as well as the unbreachable safe space of the Continental, it's another thing that must be obeyed. So he asks Lance Reddick to watch the dog, rest in peace, and then gets groped for a bit at an art gallery by Batwoman before squashing his instinct to kill Antonio and just agree to his request.
I want you to kill my sister.
Because the high table holds a single place for each major crime faction of the world, and if Gianna D'Antonio dies,
I can't help but wonder what I might accomplish instead.
he might not be happy about it, but John fetches an old deposit box for a bit of emergency drip and heads over to Rome under the watchful eyes of Santino's bodyguard, Ares. This city also has a Continental, and after promising that he's not there to kill the Pope, John gets given a room where it turns out, if you've got the gold, the underground world of elite killers get access to an in-house sommelier that hooks him up with the very latest in gun porn for all the different occasions. After that, it's a custom Kevlar suit or two, and the man is ready to go to the elite high-end party set among the ruins of a Colosseum where crime lords mingle and shake hands with bishops. Careful! Gianna D'Antonio is the belle of the ball, and also a total shark when it comes to side negotiations about taking people's territory and killing their kids. She instantly recognizes John as the spectre of her own death. They're old friends too, but she doesn't argue the bond of his marker despite her disgust at her brother.
I lived my life my way, and now it's time my way.
And instead goes out on her own terms with a nice hot bath, suggesting that John think about Helen and his sins as she fades away. Cheeky headshot just to make sure. But on the way out, Gianna's bodyguard Cassian recognizes the old professional and is very sorry to discover that John is back on the job. So as the club music escalates, so does the danger, as the entire crowd cheer out to the murder that's happening in their midst, as John works his close quarters magic to decimate the guards on his way to his extraction point. those Kevlar suits can stop bullets, but they absolutely do not cushion the blow, and Ares turns up to confirm that he has of course been double-crossed, with her team now also planning to kill John after a job well done, just to tidy up the loose end. Fortunately, he'd been planting big guns all the way along his exit route, and manages to assault rifle the shit out of everyone before finishing off a few headshots and continuing on like an absolute machine, before then upgrading to a combat shotgun to complete the power weapons loadout from GoldenEye and basically flex all over the place with a range of tactical reload variations as he pumps all of the Roman boys silly without even buying them dinner. So the escape is kind of good, but Cassian has caught up after confirming the death of his boss, and this guy is a solid match for Wick and very pissed off. Both of them are Kevlar wrapped, and both of them are ruthless and efficient fighters with experienced groundwork technique, to the point that even a knee pit mid-choke reload isn't enough to shake Cassian off. But as luck would have it, they smash through onto Continental grounds, forcing a pause to any business and giving them little to do other than having a sit down and a drink. John explains he had no choice, and Cassian explains that although he's still going to kill him, he'll at least make it quick.
Consider it a professional courtesy.
Ares is there too, just to keep the pressure up, and Santino calls over as well.
But what kind of man would I be if I didn't avenge my sister's murder? John.
That's not good. And he starts to get a little nervous and phone into the assassin's call center that's manned entirely by vintage suicide girls to place a $7 million bounty on John's head that gets sent out to every assassin in America. Winston still makes Santiago close John's marker as being complete and warns him that now the man is freed from any commitment, this dance with the devil might just come back to bite him. But back in New York, it turns out there's at least one professional assassin for every 10 members of the population, as John suddenly finds himself running a gauntlet of killers on his way back home, including buskers who won't be playing again, sumos who won't be sumoing anytime soon, please stay dead, and two guys at a bar that he manages to kill with
a pencil. I know, I've heard the story, sir.
Fucking pencil!
Then Cassian catches up again, and the two men engage in some very suppressed gunfire up top and then down in the metro, as they both remain ice cold and low-key about trying some public murder. Seems like John just can't catch a break, even when waiting for a train, so he's forced to properly face off against Cassian into a Casino Royale knife tension standoff before it all boils over, where John does just manage to have the edge when it comes to the old-fashioned ways, leaving the tip in Cassian's aorta, but not so deep as to kill him.
Consider this a professional courtesy.
So, still under threat, John runs up to the nearest babbling homeless guy, because it turns out that they're also part of a network of assassins who have John's back for an emergency fee and take him to meet their underground leader over at a soup kitchen, who turns out to be Morpheus. What? So whilst reminding us about the terrible pigeon mission in Marvel's Spider-Man, this guy explains he's the Bowery King, and that he's actually met Wick before, back in the day when he sometimes used to let people live. So John asks for help getting to Santino, because now that he's got that seat at the high table, he'll soon be coming for New York and everybody's turf in a gang war.
Somebody please get this man a gun.
So instead of claiming a $7 million bounty, he gives John Wick a gun with 7 rounds. Well, it's another high-end function for the elite, both above and below the legal threshold, where John interrupts the gallery shindig to immediately burn through his limited bullets on henchmen and stalk Santino through the exhibits, whilst constantly having to snatch guns as he kills people, and living out my one-man army power fantasies from when I was 13 by suppressing the armed mafioso with jujitsu and gunplay that makes for some pretty impressive multitasking for a man, and the bodies continue to pile up as he clean executes the lot of them before entering into the modern art mirror zone nightmare from Enter the Dragon. Santino tries to talk his way into John's head as they hunt each other down through the confusing landscape, but Ares is caught up with her hit squad, who have what it takes to give the man a hard time. forcing John to stay one step ahead with some deadly spatial awareness. And knowing that being hunted by the Baba Yaga just won't stop, Ares chooses to stay behind and buy her boss a little time. She turns out to be fast and deadly, with John's Kevlar clothing being the only thing from stopping his guts from falling out. But in the end, she's no match for the monster, and Wick cleans out all of her equipment while she bleeds to death. Santino makes it over to the Continental for a little safe space of his own and starts making demands of a manager to excommunicate John, seeing as he's such a big shot now with his seat at the table. But Lovejoy isn't easily threatened by anyone and simply offers Santino the same level of hospitality as any other guest. But after everything, John has been pushed too far, and he carelessly breaks the rules of the Continental by straight up killing Santino in the middle of a sentence before the man could flee beyond John's reach. Oh my god. And as John goes back home, he remembers that as well as having just burnt all of his bridges, Santino had also burnt down his house. And so the concierge fetches him for his one last meeting as a free man, where Winston lets him know that the bounty on his head has gone international at the behest of the table, as well as no longer being welcome at any branch of the Continental. In fact, John's only alive right now because he's given John a 1 hour head start for being fond of the guy.
Whoever comes, whoever it is, I'll kill them. Of course you will.
A killer who had better get moving, because now every single assassin on the planet is going to be coming for his head. John Wick is getting a move on in the big city because the worldwide bounty on his head is about to go live, and he's a little low on resources with even the homeless Bowery network now closed to him. So he makes sure that the dog is taken care of and goes to the New York Public Library, seeing as it's free, where he's been keeping an emergency stash with a cross and a marker among some obscure volumes. But before his hour of freedom is up, Andre the Skinny Giant decides to get a head start for the sake of the $14 million bounty on his head. So John gives him a rather percussive education on the Russian literary classics, proving that this guy had bitten off more than he could chew, before snapping his neck and heading over to an underground doctor to get the cut in his artery fixed, whilst the seconds literally tick away until all underworld services are suspended, forcing John to finish himself off. And so the consequences of his actions in the last movie go live to paint the biggest target ever on John Wick's back. So he says thank you for the help because bullets are his love language, and the heat is on as a team of Chinese killers chase him through the streets into an old weapons museum where John has moments to spare to strip apart a bunch of old revolvers for an emergency rebuild to blow a guy away before smashing glass and kicking ass, trading kidney shots for nutcrackers, and fighting off assassins in an all-you-can-eat buffet of vintage knives where everyone gets grabby, and Wick nearly loses his own junk before a close-range knife-throwing nightmare kicks in that tests everybody's reflexes, resulting in John systematically pin-cushioning the absolute Jesus out of a couple of guys and using his combination of takedowns to eventually drive the point home, so to speak, into this guy before letting another one take a real good close look at his favorite knife before wrapping up business with the Hatchet Gang. So then an Italian hit team clip him with the car and chase him into some stables so that the boys can roll around in the hay before John improvises some equestrian slap techniques to weaponize the horses and drag back out into the streets again for some great shots through the city and an interception from some bikers, where John proves to be an accomplished rider by sliding into a single stirrup for reach around to wrap up the action and finally give him a moment to breathe. This has now bumped the contract up to $15 million before John uses that cross to gain some after dark entry to the ballet. Turns out this is the crime organization of Voruska Roma, a group that's been training orphans like John to become killers for the assassin's underworld, be it through the methods of tolerating pain or the ways of inflicting damage. The director should be excommunicating him too, but it looks like the Sons of Belarus get to call in a one-time ticket that burns you out of the family for good, because John wants passage to Casablanca. An adjudicator has arrived at the Continental, a rather unlikable representative of the high table that's investigating the death of Santino Di Antonio on what should have been safe ground. Turns out that thanks to the head start he gave John, Winston is under investigation and soon to be replaced, which is something he takes very seriously. She then goes over to Morpheus and the Bowery crew for providing John with a gun to kill a high table member, telling him to give up his throne in 7 days, which he doesn't take seriously and laughs her off. This was a mistake because under her authority, she employs a bunch of practicing shinobi assassins to take care of everyone who has assisted Wick, and their leader Zero is super keen to get involved. slicing and dicing his way into the underground network, while his students make use of their mastery of the shadows to disorient and deliver punishment to the forces of a Bowery king who now pays for those 7 bullets with 7 slices instead.
Well, sometimes you gotta cut a motherfucker.
They then slay their way into the ballet school as they step in and out of the shadows. But the Ruska Roma and the High Table are 2 groups that have a special understanding, so she just receives a slap on the wrist instead. Down in Casablanca, John is a recognized face and about to go through some more of the same, but it turns out the manager of the Moroccan Continental has for some reason granted him amnesty, and mostly it's just so that she can enjoy shooting him herself because they're old acquaintances from back in the day before she moved up into management.
Good to see you too.
Turns out that John holds a marker of his own over Sophia for once keeping her daughter safe and incognito, even to herself. What he's after is a face-to-face with the Elder, known as he who sits above the table. So they take the dogs for a walk over to see Bron, a rather slimy manager of the local Assassin's Coin production who knows the Elder's location, but wants to take a dog in return for the directions, and then shoots it after Sophia says no. Well, this turns the whole mood sour, resulting in a bloodbath where, unlike John, she manages to still respect her superiors and restrain her feelings to leg shots only.
You shot my dog.
I get it.
Before they then murder their way out through a bazaar of hashashins and various thugs, using a combination of gun techniques along with the trained dogs to take down the competition. These animals provide an effective support option to alleviate suppressing fire and make for some cool canine combat takedown combinations, where even a high vantage point isn't going to keep anyone safe from getting mauled, with everyone ending up getting torn apart. John's also there doing his thing, but by now we all know what that looks like, and Sophia drives him out to look for the elder assassin and lets him know just how much she'll miss him before going off her own way, because taking the directions from Bron seriously, John walks off into a spirit journey deep into the desert and follows the stars until he almost dies from the exposure in the hopes that the elder will choose to find him. And he comes round to find himself in the presence of he who is above the table, Altair, the one man ruling over all the assassins, who has the power to remove the bounty and the excommunicado, whilst also binding him as a lapdog assassin to the High Table for the rest of his life. But before that happens, he's been tasked with killing Winston, who's been deemed as getting too big for his boots, which will only then get the killers off his back. Well, it's still the best offer he's going to hear all day, so John reaffirms his fealty with an Assassin's Creed ring finger before getting another suit and being sent back home. Assassins are still out to kill him the moment he enters the city, but in these circles it's those trained in the art of shadow that end up being the bigger fish, keeping John alive and available for their boss. But the old sudden appearance disappearance classic doesn't impress the bogeyman, who knows how to pull off the same trick himself. So he gets his hands on a sweet ride on the way out and ends up in a rolling ninja bike chase where he finds himself having to sword fight at high speed, which is quite simply a terrible idea for someone controlling a motorbike, before jamming up their tires to finish off the chase and crashing himself right up to the finish line, where John slaps across the boundary of the Continental before Zero can finish him off, because he at least still has to respect the safe space rules. So instead, the guy just fanboys over the legend of John Wick in the waiting room whilst he gets to catch up with the dog. Zero comes out with the old "we're the same, you and I" stuff that bad guys like to say, before John goes up to meet Lovejoy in his showroom collection space reserved for special occasions. Winston knows why John is here, and he gives the man the choice of living as a lapdog or perhaps instead surviving as a free man, because he's decided not to step down after all, which is going to put him at war with the High Table.
Will you be putting a bullet in his head?
No, I don't think I will.
So the adjudicator makes the call and deconsecrates the Continental New York for being naughty boys. The concierge makes sure that John arms himself appropriately, while all of the other guests check out of the hotel. Zero and his students will lead the strike, with the High Table sending over their own forces for support, arriving by coach like a murder field trip, while John heads out to hunt whilst the manager waits it out with a drink. The concierge and the rest of the hotel staff are a capable team, but not prepared prepared for an armored shock troop war, as much like the later levels of a video game, this lot are wearing full-body bulletproof armor, meaning that despite his usual headshot accuracy, John has to work extra hard to keep them engaged and find the gaps in order to reach the soft, gooey centers. Well, the first wave is down, and both men are pissed at the 5-star criminal rating, returning for some bigger guns with armor-piercing slugs. And this allows the slick pair of gentlemen to start blowing away chunks of the kill squad wide open like watermelons as they let off a little steam, and occupying them with his usual handgun style so that he can get in some more quick fluid clip reloading. John makes parts of their heads disappear into mist, taking things down to the pool level for a quick lesson in fluid mechanics before John reaches over to turn the last of the hit team into a bath bomb.
I know you believe you can keep this up, but I assure you...
Lol. Then John gets back up into the Kingdom of the Crystal Skulls to be accosted by Zero's ninja students who perform hit-and-run strikes in and out of the shadows to keep Wick off balance, before they then use him to break almost every single piece of glass on the whole floor. However, there's always a price to pay for playing with your food, because once they get the swords out for a sustained attack, John maneuvers around the toughened glass walls to secure a friendly fire slice, and then enjoy a little bit of murder payback for all of his trouble. But the gauntlet continues with the two raid boys, who as a pair are able to increase the difficulty levels yet again with their quick and agile combination strikes, but who are also big fans of the legendary killer, managing to keep things respectful, and after another glass smash out, give Wick a little time to get into the zone again, before leading to some karambit versus belt action, where John finds himself having to close quarters ground fight for both of them for dominant positions, whilst also trying not to get stabbed for his trouble, where he finally manages to body slam the both of them through the floor, but ultimately letting them live, seeing as they were being so polite. But this film just keeps on going, with Mark Dacascos as the final boss round, who employs short sword techniques, along with Tekken-style fighting moves, where every shot is stylishly lit. But after about 2 hours of relentless movie, it's also kind of blurring together, before John turns the tables by dropping into the shadows himself with his own hit-and-run tactics, getting in some surgically precise ligament stabs, and taking a moment to relish in hunting the man down and letting him try to fend off the Baba Yaga with only one hand, before he stops toying with Zero and skewers the guy for all the trouble.
That was a pretty good fight, huh?
And now, with the first wave defeated, the adjudicator calls in a parley with Winston, who's now in a position of strength to negotiate back his managerial position, having used John Wick this whole time as a bargaining chip, before repledging his own fealty by suddenly shooting John off the side of a building, where he takes an absolutely fatal bump on the fast route back down to the streets. Oh my god. But with the Continental restored, John Wick's body is missing, because it turns out the Bowery King survived and has been licking his wounds deep underground with some very serious vengeance in mind, and that same hatred is the one reason that John Wick refuses to slip through death's door. So thanks a lot for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed having John Wick 3 crammed inside you. Make sure you followed by hitting that subscribe button for some more full-on recaps, and get in the comments to tell me what you'd like to see crammed next. Take care.